The moment my father uttered those words, the grand ballroom at the Four Seasons Boston seemed to freeze in time. Crystal chandeliers suspended above us caught the light, casting prismatic rainbows across the faces of Boston's elite, who had gathered to celebrate my sister Caroline's 30th birthday. I stood at the back of the room, anonymous in my faded blue dress from last season, a glass of untouched champagne warming in my hand. Caroline Parker will be the sole heir to the Parker legacy, my father announced, his voice booming with pride. Parker Enterprises valued at $80 million, the $15 million mansion in Back Bay, and a brand new Tesla. All of it will belong to our perfect daughter. The crowd erupted in applause. Champagne flutes clinked in celebration. Caroline stood center stage in her crystal-studded gown, a practiced smile of gracious humility on her face. Yet when her eyes swept across the room and found mine, I saw something else entirely. Triumph, victory, the culmination of 30 years of competition she had always been destined to win. I am Harper Parker, 27 years old, the invisible daughter of the illustrious Parker family. And I couldn't possibly have known that in exactly 10 minutes, everything I understood about my place in this family would be completely upended. The walnut dining table stretches so long, it feels as though the distance between me and my parents is an entire world. This table has been the center of our family life for as long as I can remember, its gleaming surface reflecting every triumph and disappointment, every moment of judgment and rare praise. My father, Thomas Parker, always sits at the head, his posture rigid, his cold eyes carrying judgment in every glance. Thomas wasn't born into wealth. He grew up in a working-class neighborhood in Detroit, the son of a factory worker who lost his job when the plant closed. Thomas worked his way through college on scholarships and part-time jobs, developing a hunger for success and recognition that would never quite be satisfied. He wears his suits like armor, his Harvard MBA like a shield against anyone who might question his belonging in Boston's upper echelon. To his right sits my mother, Eleanor Parker, née Westbrook heir to Old Boston money, who maintains a flawless exterior and wears a constant polite smile. Behind that smile lives a woman perpetually concerned with appearances, with what others might think with maintaining the perfect family image she'd been raised to value above all else. Her eyes often betray disdain whenever they land on me, as if my very existence threatens the carefully curated tableau of Parker family excellence. To his left sits Caroline, the family's golden daughter, who always occupies what is considered the seat of honor. Caroline, with her perfect Harvard credentials, her effortless grace, her ability to charm every room she enters. Caroline, whose achievements line the walls of our home, while mine are tucked away in drawers if kept at all. And then there's me, Harper, pushed to the very end of the table so far that I have to lean forward just to catch what they're saying. This arrangement isn't just habit. It's a physical manifestation of our family hierarchy, a visual reminder every night of where I stand. Caroline at the center of the universe, and me forever orbiting at the edges, a distant planet barely warmed by the sun. Dinners always unfold like a well-rehearsed play. My father begins by asking Caroline about her day, about achievements he already knows would give him something worth bragging about. My mother chimes in with exaggerated praise, as if every A Caroline earned were a Nobel Prize. I sit quietly waiting for a chance to share something about myself. But almost every time, just as I open my mouth, another question is tossed to Caroline, or my father abruptly changes the subject. I rehearse in my head dozens of times how to share something interesting. But by the time I get the opportunity, all eyes have already shifted away. My voice echoes into a void no one cares to fill, then fades into silence, as if it had never existed. One evening when I was 8 years old remains seared into my memory. I had poured my heart into a landscape painting for an art contest at school. When my name was announced for first prize, I ran home clutching the certificate, the ink still fresh and fragrant. I placed it on the dining table and eagerly shared my story, heart hammering with hope that this time finally they would be proud. My father glanced at it once before saying coldly, "At least you didn't color outside the lines." Then he turned to raise his glass to celebrate Caroline's gold medal in mathematics. The family immediately began planning a party for her success. My painting was left behind on the kitchen counter, as forgotten as I was. The strange part was, as a child, I couldn't understand why my achievements never seemed to measure up. I tried harder. I joined more clubs. I stayed up later studying. But nothing changed. When I brought home an essay my teacher praised as creative, my father didn't even read it. He only asked, "Did Caroline score higher?" In their eyes, I was nothing more than a side character in the perfect story of Caroline Parker. I learned to stay quiet to avoid ridicule. I stopped raising my hand to show certificates, stopped telling stories about interesting days at school. I swallowed even the smallest joys, because every attempt to share only meant being interrupted or dismissed. Silence became my fragile armor against the scrutinizing looks and cold words of my own family. Throughout my childhood and into my teenage years, surrounded by cold stares and biting remarks that made me believe I was nothing more than a shadow in the family, there was one person who truly saw me, understood me, and gave me the sense that I mattered. That was my grandfather, Benjamin Westbrook. He lived in Cambridge in an old red brick house with a small garden full of lavender that bloomed into soft waves of purple each spring. He was the founder of Parker Enterprises, though it was called Westbrook Trading when he built it from nothing. After retiring, he spent most of his time reading writing in his journals and tending to his garden. Every time I visited him in Cambridge, it felt like stepping into a different world, one where I was no longer the forgotten daughter, but simply Harper, his granddaughter. What made him special was that he never once asked about my grades, whether I was keeping up with Caroline, or how I had made my parents proud. Instead, whenever I sat beside him on the wooden bench in his garden, he would pour me a cup of warm herbal tea and ask in his calm voice, "What do you love, Harper? How do you want to live?" At first, those questions left me hesitant, because no one in my family had ever cared to ask about my feelings or dreams. But as I grew familiar with the kindness in his gaze, I began to open up. I told him that I loved painting, that sometimes I imagined opening a small gallery in the North End, where people could come to find peace. I shared that I enjoyed listening to others, that I found comfort in empathy, even if no one else saw it as a skill. He nodded, his gentle eyes glowing with genuine joy. "That is who you are," he said. "Not grades, not medals. You have something Caroline doesn't. Patience, humility, and the ability to listen. One day when the time comes, you will understand the true value of those things." His words etched into me like a prophecy. I didn't fully understand them then, but every time I returned to our cold Beacon Hill mansion and sat again at the distant end of the dining table, the memory of his warm voice echoed in my mind like a dim light against the suffocating darkness of disdain. When I was 16, after a heated argument with Caroline about her mocking my part-time job at a local coffee shop, I ran upstairs crying uncontrollably and called my grandfather. Just a few hours later, he drove from Cambridge to our house in Boston. He didn't make a scene or scold anyone. He simply knocked gently on my door, sat down beside me, and held my hand. "My dear, never mistake their blindness for the truth," he said slowly. "They don't see you, but that doesn't mean you don't exist. You have something that Caroline and even your parents don't. A heart that knows empathy. And one day people will realize that you are the one strong enough to carry the weight." I hugged him, feeling my heart ease for the first time in days. To me, my grandfather was not only the family member who stood by my side, but also the silent witness to all the pain I endured. He didn't need many words. His presence alone was enough to make me feel I wasn't completely invisible. Trips to Cambridge became the rare days when I could breathe freely. I remember the mornings he took me walking along the Charles River, pointing out the rowers already out before sunrise, telling me, "They may not be the best, but they are persistent, and persistence is the foundation of victory." I remember the afternoons spent in his small library, when he would take down an old philosophy book, read me a few passages, then ask what I thought. When I hesitantly shared my opinion, he never laughed at me. He simply nodded and said, "You think more deeply than you realize." Those words, simple as they seemed, carried a quiet power that sustained me. Thanks to him, I began to believe that I wasn't completely useless. I didn't yet know how to prove myself to the world, but at least I had one person who believed in me. By the time I turned 16, the gap between Caroline and me was no longer just about praise or criticism at the dinner table. It had become a chasm impossible to fill. My father began taking Caroline with him to Parker Enterprises board meetings, the company he proudly called the family's empire. Though I knew from my grandfather, it had originally been Westbrook Trading until my father changed the name after taking control. I remember mornings when the sun was just rising over the Boston Common, and the black luxury car would already be waiting at our townhouse gate. Caroline, dressed impeccably, would climb into the car with my father, her eyes glowing with pride. From my attic bedroom window, I watched their figures disappear down Beacon Street, my heart swelling with the ache of being left behind like an unnecessary object in the family's grand portrait. While Caroline was guided step by step by my father to become his successor, I was left with the tasks no one wanted. My mother told me to clean the living room before guests arrived, reminding me over and over, "At least you should help keep the house tidy so people won't think we have a lazy daughter." When the company held events, Caroline wore elegant gowns and stood beside my parents in photos that appeared in the Boston Globe's business section. Meanwhile, I was sent to buy extra bottles of wine, prepare cold towels, or clean up after everyone left. Even while living in the same house, I felt like a guest, someone present, but never considered a true part of the family. I knew I could not wait for recognition from them, so I searched for ways to take care of myself. I took a morning shift at a small coffee shop near Emerson College, starting at 600 a.m., where the smell of roasted beans and the clatter of grinders became familiar sounds. In the afternoons, I worked at a grocery store in Somerville, stocking shelves until my arms ached. Every small paycheck I earned, I carefully tucked into a savings account for college, because I knew my parents would never support me the way they did Caroline. To them, Caroline was worthy of every investment, while I was not worth the expense. During those long, exhausting days, what hurt me most was not the aching legs or the cracked hands, but coming home. Every time I opened the door, my hair still carrying the scent of coffee, or my clothes marked with the smell of groceries, Caroline would give me a half smile and say mockingly, "Make sure you wash up Harper. Parker Enterprises clients might catch a whiff of grease and we'd all be embarrassed." Her words felt like a slap. But what hurt more was that my parents never defended me. They never corrected Caroline. Instead, they laughed along, treating it like a harmless joke. "She's right, Harper," my mother added. "You should keep up the family's image at least while you're still living here." I swallowed hard, forcing down the lump in my throat, reminding myself that any reaction would only give them more reason to ridicule me. The older Caroline grew, the more she stepped into my parents' world, while I was pushed further away. Once Caroline accompanied my father to a conference in New York, surrounded by investors and prominent politicians. I overheard my father on the phone with a friend saying, "Caroline is only 23 and already understands how the company works. She is the jewel of my family." I stood just outside the door, only a few steps away, but in those words I realized I had never had a place. I was not my father's daughter in any way he was proud of. I was only the extra name that existed to be measured against Caroline's perfection. But there was something about Caroline that few people saw. Behind her perfect smile and impeccable credentials lay a woman buckling under the weight of impossible expectations. I remember one night when we were teenagers finding her crying in her room after our father had berated her for coming in second at a science competition. I sat beside her on the bed, and in a rare moment of vulnerability, she whispered, "You don't understand the pressure, Harper. You don't know what it's like having to be perfect all the time." In that moment, I saw Caroline not as my tormentor, but as another victim of our father's relentless ambition. The difference was that while I had been cast aside, she had been placed on a pedestal so high she lived in constant fear of falling. As the years passed, those moments of connection grew fewer. Caroline built walls around herself, wearing her perfection like armor. Sometimes when she was particularly cruel to me, I wondered if it wasn't hatred driving her actions, but envy for the freedom that came with being overlooked for the liberty to fail that I had been inadvertently granted. Caroline has talent and intelligence, my grandfather once told me during one of our walks. But you have something she's never been allowed to have the right to make mistakes. The truth was, neither of us had chosen our roles in this family. We had been cast in them since childhood, molded to fit our parents' vision of who we should be. Caroline, the shining star. Me, the shadow cast by her light. In the days leading up to Caroline's 30th birthday, our Beacon Hill home transformed into a bustling construction site of celebration planning. My mother barely slept, rushing from calls to florists to endless revisions of the menu with the hotel chef. Her voice echoed through the halls in a constant flurry, while staff hurried back and forth with boxes of gifts, bottles of champagne, and table linens. My father was just as busy, though his busyness carried the weight of power. Phone calls with shareholders, instructions to the company's media team, and discreet meetings with reporters to ensure that Caroline's birthday would not simply be a party, but a public declaration that she was the heir. In that whirlwind of preparation, I was nothing more than a faint shadow blending into the backdrop. No one asked what I thought, and no one cared what I might wear. The only task my mother handed me was a thick stack of seating charts. "Don't mess this up, Harper," she stressed, pressing the papers into my hands. "This guest has to sit next to that official. This investor must be placed at the same table with the Harvard board member. Do you understand?" I nodded, though I knew perfectly well that my role at the party would be limited to making sure everyone else sat in the right place while I remained at the far back row where no light would ever reach. That day, my mother took Caroline to try on dresses on Newberry Street. The fitting room glittered with shimmering gowns, and the sales associates flattered her as if she were a Hollywood star. I stood outside, arms crossed, waiting silently for hours. No one thought of picking out a dress for me. When I finally let slip, "What about me?" my mother gave me a quick glance and brushed me off. "You can wear the blue dress from last year. No need to draw attention, Harper." I bit my lip and said nothing more. The truth was that dress was old. The zipper caught a little and the fabric had lost its sheen. But in their eyes, I was never meant to stand out in any photograph. The night before the party, I stood quietly in front of the mirror, slipping into that faded blue dress. It pinched at the chest and hung loose at the waist, making me look awkward and out of place. I turned, staring at my reflection, and asked myself, would anyone notice me tomorrow, or would I just be a blur in the background of the frame? The answer was painfully clear, and yet I had no idea that tomorrow would be the last day I would ever stand in the shadows of my family. During the last few months, I had become increasingly concerned about my grandfather. His cough had worsened, and he moved more slowly, leaning heavily on his cane. When I suggested telling my parents about his declining health, he shook his head firmly. "Now is not the time to burden them with this," he said, though we both knew the truth was that they wouldn't care enough to be burdened. One afternoon, just a week before Caroline's birthday party, he led me into his library, a room lined with leather-bound books and smelling of old paper and pipe tobacco. He walked to a painting of the Boston Harbor that hung behind his desk, swung it open on hidden hinges to reveal a safe embedded in the wall. "When the time comes, open this," he said, his voice steady despite his frail appearance. "Everything will become clear." Before I could ask what he meant, he changed the subject, asking me about my latest painting. But the moment stayed with me, a quiet foreboding that something significant was about to happen. Later that week, I accidentally overheard my father on the phone in his study, talking about restructuring the company to minimize Benjamin's lingering influence. The cold calculation in his voice sent shivers down my spine. I wondered if my grandfather knew what was happening behind his back, if that was why he had shown me the safe. The morning of the party, the whole family headed to the Four Seasons Boston. A long limousine waited at the door, the driver in a black suit holding the door open, as my parents and Caroline stepped inside. I quietly adjusted my dress and slipped into the back row of seats. Caroline glowed in her brand new gown, the crystal neckline sparkling her smile wide, as if the entire world revolved around her. My parents fussed over her, straightening her father's tie, coaching her on greetings and handshakes, while I sat in silence staring out the window at the familiar streets I once walked to my part-time jobs. The contrast made me feel like an outsider who had mistakenly boarded the car of a family that never truly considered me one of them. When we arrived at the hotel, the sight nearly overwhelmed me. Chandeliers poured down golden light across the gilded lobby. Hundreds of staff hurried about arranging tables, and the air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume. I was handed a seating chart and told to check every place card to make sure guests sat exactly where they were supposed to. No one asked if I had eaten or if I needed a break. I was simply another cog in the machinery, a small replaceable part, and most of all, a figure destined to be hidden in the day's grand picture. Music swelled as the great doors to the ballroom opened, revealing a space drenched in crystal light. From my place at the very back, I could see the entire room like a glittering stage. Guests streamed in renowned business figures I had only ever seen in the news-polished politicians in tailored suits and Caroline's Harvard friends, each one radiating the effortless confidence of people born to be celebrated. Laughter rippled through the air, glasses clinked in rhythm, and together they painted a portrait of extravagance, one I knew I would never belong to. Caroline stood at the center like a star blazing against a dark sky. Her crystal-studded gown caught the light, turning each step she took into a performance. Guests crowded around to congratulate her, shaking hands, embracing her, as if this were not merely the birthday of a 30-year-old woman, but a historic event in Boston's elite circles. I sat still, my hands clenched tightly in my lap, trying not to let myself feel misplaced. Every time I lifted my eyes, I caught Caroline's glance, a look that reminded me I was nothing more than a side character in her grand story. As I scanned the room, my attention was caught by a man I didn't recognize. Tall, broad-shouldered, moving with a steady confidence, his stern face free of the polite smiles that plastered the other guests. His eyes, sharp and observant, seemed to be searching the crowd for something or someone. When his gaze locked with mine, he didn't look away as most people did when they accidentally noticed me. Instead, he held my gaze for a moment, a flicker of recognition passing over his features. I looked away quickly, unsettled by the intensity of his attention. When I glanced back, he had disappeared into the crowd. The climax of the evening came when my father, Thomas Parker, walked onto the stage. He wore a flawless black tuxedo, his face glowing with pride. My mother accompanied him, her arm linked with his, her smile radiant, as if her entire life had led to this moment. When the microphone was handed over, the entire ballroom fell silent, every gaze fixed on him. My father cleared his throat, raised his glass, and spoke in his deep, commanding voice. "Ladies and gentlemen, today is not only my daughter Caroline's birthday. It is also the moment to announce to all our friends, partners, and family, Caroline Parker will be the sole and rightful heir of the Parker legacy." A ripple of whispers swept through the crowd. I swallowed hard, my heart pounding. My father pressed on, his voice growing even more triumphant. "Parker Enterprises valued at $80 million. The $15 million mansion on Back Bay, along with a brand new Tesla. All of it will belong to our perfect daughter. Caroline is our pride, the proof of this family's brilliant future." The moment his words ended, the ballroom erupted in thunderous applause. Cheers and the clinking of glasses echoed endlessly, making me feel as though the entire room was trembling. Caroline stepped forward, her lips curved into a satisfied smile. She turned toward me, her eyes sweeping past with a look of challenge, as if carving into my heart a cruel truth. "You've lost. You were never chosen." I sat frozen, forcing myself to breathe evenly. My chest tightened as if squeezed in a vice, each word from my father slicing deeper into old wounds. Then I heard my mother's voice, soft but sharp enough to cut. "Harper, don't ruin your sister's special day." I turned and saw her still smiling radiantly, though her cold eyes brushed past me like a warning. Amid the grandeur, I felt like a misplaced shadow. No one looked at me. No one mentioned me. I saw my reflection faintly mirrored in the crystal panels at the back of the room, the faded blue dress, my hunched posture, my eyes glistening as I fought back tears. While Caroline stood radiant, basking in applause like a queen being crowned, I was left with the suffocating weight of humiliation pressing against my chest. In that moment, my grandfather Benjamin's words came back to me. "You have things Caroline does not. One day when the time comes, you will understand." But right then, I saw no light. I only felt myself pushed deeper into the shadows, nailed into the role of the loser, before a cheering crowd. The music in the ballroom pulsed on the chatter and clinking of glasses, swirling together into a noisy whirlwind that swallowed every pause. I sat still, trying to make myself look like part of the decor, no different from the empty chair tucked in the back. That's when I noticed him again, the same man I'd seen earlier, moving through the crowd with purpose. This time he was walking directly toward me, his eyes never leaving my face. The steady thud of his leather shoes echoed across the wooden floor, briefly drowning out the soft music in my ears. I lifted my head, my heartbeat racing, breath caught in my chest. No one else noticed him, their eyes fixed on Caroline and my father, as they accepted congratulations from Boston's elite. He stopped in front of my table, set down a thick white envelope, and leaned close, his voice low and gravelly, but certain. "It's time to tell them who you really are." Those words reverberated through my mind, sounding less like a message and more like a command. My hand trembled as I touched the envelope, feeling its weight and stiffness as if it carried something far heavier than ordinary papers. I quickly slid it into my lap, hiding it under the table, terrified that my parents or Caroline might catch sight of it. Sweat beaded on my forehead despite the air conditioning that kept the room cool. I looked up ready to ask something, but the man had already straightened, giving me a subtle nod, as if to seal the moment, then turned and walked away. His steps merged into the crowd, swallowed by the sea of guests, and within seconds, he was gone. I sat frozen, my heart pounding so violently it felt as though the entire room could hear it. I glanced around, but no one was paying attention to me. Glasses were still being raised, laughter still ringing, all for Caroline. No one noticed the envelope that had landed before me like a bolt of lightning, splitting the night sky. I laid my trembling hand over the envelope, tracing its sharp edges. A part of me wanted to tear it open immediately, but another part trembled with fear. 1,000 questions crashed through my mind. What's inside? Why me? Who sent him? I thought of my grandfather Benjamin, of his stern yet trusting gaze, of the safe behind the painting. A thought flickered. Could this be what he meant when he said the time would come? My fingers shook as I slipped them under the flap and slowly tore it open. The sound of ripping paper was faint, but to me it roared inside my chest. I pulled out a thick stack of documents with firm embossed edges stamped with the familiar Parker Enterprises logo and a deep blue legal seal. My eyes darted across the first lines, widening as I read, my throat tightening with each word. On that white page, the name printed was not Caroline's, as I had always assumed, but mine, Harper Grace Parker. Below it, bold lines confirmed my legal ownership of more than 51% of Parker Enterprises shares, along with a detailed list of trust accounts in my name and inheritance documents for the Back Bay mansion. I read the lines over and over, afraid my eyes were deceiving me. My heart pounded so fast it felt ready to burst from my chest. I turned a few more pages. Each document bore official seal's legal signatures, and at the top of the final page was the tremblingly familiar name, Benjamin Westbrook, my grandfather. His handwriting was sharp yet steady, the strokes firm as if to erase any trace of doubt. My throat went dry, and I had to swallow several times before I could breathe evenly again. Tucked behind the stack of papers was a handwritten letter neatly folded. The paper had yellowed slightly with age, carrying the faint scent of old ink and a hint of pipe tobacco. I recognized instantly it was his. My hands shook as I opened the letter, the careful strokes coming alive on the page, like his voice whispering directly into my ear. "Harper, if you are reading these words, it means the time has come. I have watched both you and your sister grow. Caroline has intelligence and sharpness, but within her lies a pride that too easily turns into arrogance. Your father Thomas built wealth, but in doing so he lost compassion and allowed ambition to eclipse love. You, Harper, grew up in shadows and silence, but that silence forged in you a strength they will never have. You know humility, you understand the value of listening, and you know how to rise even when pressed to the very bottom. Those are the true qualities of a leader. Everything I built, I place in your hands. The future of this family belongs to you. I read every word, my vision blurring with tears. 1,000 memories flooded back afternoons, sitting in my grandfather's garden. His gentle questions, what do you love? How do you want to live? All piecing together into a single vivid picture. He hadn't only comforted me with words, he had been preparing me all along quietly but deliberately, so that today, in the very moment the world saw me as nothing but a shadow, he placed in my hands the brightest light. I bit my lip, holding back sobs. In my head echoed Caroline's mocking laugh, my father's jeers, my mother's cold comparisons. For years, they branded me the invisible one, turning me into the family's afterthought, even at the dinner table where I sat so far away. Yet here in my hands lay undeniable proof of the opposite. My grandfather had never been blind. He had seen me, seen the smallest things in me, that they had overlooked, and entrusted me with everything. Pressing the letter against my chest, I closed my eyes. For the first time in my life, I felt seen, acknowledged. The pain of all those years broke open not in bitterness, but in a new kind of faith. I was no longer Harper the girl at the end of the table wearing an old dress dismissed and belittled. I was Harper Parker, the one Benjamin Westbrook had chosen to carry forward his legacy. I drew in a deep breath, letting the strength of his words fill every corner of my being. Outside, the music still played, the applause still thundered. Caroline still stood on stage, soaking in the praise. No one knew that in the far corner of the room, the entire balance of power had quietly shifted. In my hands was the truth that would change everything, proof that I was more than they had ever allowed me to be. I looked down at the documents once more, then raised my head, my gaze steadier than it had ever been. I understood that the moment of confrontation would come, and this time I would not be silent. The music swirled around me as I stared at the documents in my lap, each word rewriting the story I'd been told my entire life. The weight of the truth pressed against my chest, making it difficult to breathe. In that moment, I understood what I had to do, but my body seemed frozen, caught between 27 years of silence and the sudden power to speak. I placed the documents carefully back into the envelope and stood. The chair scraped lightly against the wooden floor, though no one noticed the sound amid the celebration. I smoothed down my faded blue dress and took a step toward the stage where my father and Caroline still basked in applause. Each step I took felt like crossing a threshold I could never return from. The physical distance between my table at the back of the room and the stage seemed to represent all the years I'd spent in the shadows, all the dinners at the far end of the table, all the achievements ignored. As I approached the stage, a few nearby guests turned in surprise. I rarely drew attention, and now I was walking directly into the spotlight. I climbed the first step, then the second. My heart thundered in my chest, but my hands were steady as they clutched the envelope. My father was in the middle of accepting congratulations from the mayor of Boston when he spotted me approaching. His smile froze his eyes, narrowing in confusion and irritation. "Harper," he said in a low voice, meant only for me to hear, "Get down this instant. This isn't the time for whatever this is." I met his gaze without flinching, perhaps the first time in my life I'd done so. "Actually, Father," I said, my voice stronger than I expected, "this is exactly the time." I stepped up to the microphone before he could stop me. The ballroom fell silent, hundreds of eyes suddenly fixed on me. The sensation was dizzying after a lifetime of invisibility. Caroline's mouth opened in shock, her perfect composure cracking for the first time that evening. "Good evening," I said into the microphone, my voice echoing across the silent ballroom. "For those who don't know me, and I suspect that's most of you, I'm Harper Parker, the other daughter." Confused murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some guests exchanged glances, while others looked embarrassed, suddenly realizing they had indeed forgotten or never known that Thomas Parker had two daughters. Harper, my mother hissed from behind me, her smile still fixed in place, though her eyes blazed with anger. Don't make a scene! I ignored her and held up the envelope. I've just received something interesting. Legal documents signed by my grandfather, Benjamin Westbrook, the founder of what is now Parker Enterprises. My father lunged forward, reaching for the envelope, but I stepped away, continuing to speak with a calm that surprised even me. These documents confirm that I, not Caroline, am the majority shareholder of Parker Enterprises, 51% to be precise, along with ownership of the Back Bay Mansion and all associated trust accounts. The ballroom erupted in gasps and whispers. Camera flashes popped across the room as reporters recognized the unfolding drama. I caught sight of Caroline's face, her perfect smile completely gone, replaced by a look of utter disbelief. That's impossible. My father growled, his composed public persona crumbling. Give me those papers, they're obviously fake. I pulled out the top document, holding it up so the Parker Enterprises logo and blue legal seal were clearly visible under the chandelier light. They're quite real, father. Every signature verified, every transfer legal and binding. Grandfather made sure of that. My mother stepped forward, her voice a forced whisper. Harper, stop this nonsense immediately. You're embarrassing yourself and this family. For once, mother, I am not the one who should be embarrassed, I replied loud enough for the front rows to hear. I'm simply stating facts, facts that were meant to be revealed tonight. The mystery man who had delivered the envelope suddenly appeared at the edge of the stage. He climbed the steps with deliberate confidence and stood beside me. The room fell silent once more. My name is Michael Keating, he announced, his voice carrying across the ballroom without need of the microphone. I am the personal attorney of Benjamin Westbrook. I can confirm that every document in Miss Harper Parker's possession is authentic and legally binding. The transfers were executed last month with Mr. Westbrook of sound mind and body, witnessed by myself and 2 other attorneys. My father's face flushed deep red. This is preposterous. Benjamin had no right. He had every right, Michael interrupted calmly. As the founder and majority shareholder of what was originally Westbrook Trading, later renamed Parker Enterprises, he retained full legal authority to designate his successor. He chose Harper. Caroline finally found her voice. She stepped forward, her crystal-studded gown catching the light as she moved. This must be a mistake, she said, her voice trembling slightly. I've been groomed for this position my entire life. Harper knows nothing about running a company. I turned to face my sister directly. You've been groomed to be what father wanted you to be. But grandfather saw something different in both of us. He made his choice based on what the company truly needs for its future, not based on who could most perfectly follow father's footsteps. The ballroom doors at the back suddenly opened, and a hush fell over the crowd. Slowly leaning heavily on a wooden cane, my grandfather Benjamin Westbrook entered. Despite his frail appearance, he walked with dignity down the center aisle, his gaze fixed on the stage. The crowd parted for him, instinctively whispers following in his wake. He had been a legend in Boston business circles before his retirement, and his unexpected appearance sent shockwaves through the room. I hadn't expected him to come. His health had been declining, and he rarely attended public events anymore. When he reached the stage, I rushed down the steps to help him. He smiled at me with the same gentle kindness that had sustained me throughout my childhood, then turned to face the crowd. I believe, he said, his voice thin but clear, that some clarification is needed. My father stepped forward. Benjamin, what is the meaning of this? These documents are exactly what they appear to be, my grandfather finished, my final decision as the founder of this company. But why? My mother demanded, abandoning her usual composed demeanor. Why? Harper Caroline has been preparing for this role for years. Harper has no experience, no education for this. My grandfather's eyes, though aged, remained sharp and penetrating as he addressed the room. I know what I signed, and I know why I signed it. His gaze swept across the sea of faces before settling on my sister. Caroline has talent, intelligence, and drive. These are valuable qualities. Then his eyes shifted to my father, and his tone hardened. But Thomas, in building the company's wealth, you forgot its heart. You turned what I created into a wall that shut out compassion. An uncomfortable silence fell over the room. My grandfather continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. A company isn't just a balance sheet. It's a community of people who trust one another. Harper understands this fundamental truth in ways Caroline and Thomas never have. He turned to me, placing his weathered hand on my shoulder. Harper is the one who understands the true value of Parker Enterprises, not as a monument to personal success, but as a legacy of service and integrity. The ballroom remained utterly silent. I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning above us and feel my pulse throbbing in my wrist. Guests glanced at one another uneasily, as if suddenly aware they were witnessing the collapse of a carefully constructed facade. Caroline stood rigid beside my father, her hands gripping the edge of the podium, her crystal gown scattering fractured light like the breaking of an illusion. My mother had stepped back, her perpetual smile completely vanished, uncertainty clouding her eyes for perhaps the first time in public. And my father, his jaw clenched tight, the authority that had once dominated every room suddenly powerless in the face of his father-in-law's judgment. "Benjamin," my father finally said, his voice strained with forced calm, "this is hardly the appropriate venue for a family discussion. Let's continue this privately." "On the contrary," my grandfather replied, "this is precisely the right venue. You chose to make a public announcement about the company's future tonight. I'm simply providing the accurate version." A murmur of agreement rippled through some of the guests. I noticed several of the company's longtime employees exchanging glances, some with barely concealed satisfaction. My father's face darkened. He tugged at his bow tie as if it had suddenly become too tight, then abruptly stepped away from the microphone. "We'll see what the lawyers have to say about this," he muttered, just loud enough for those of us on stage to hear. He grabbed my mother's arm and pulled her toward the exit. She followed with one last venomous glance at me, her heels striking the floor in hurried staccato beats. They strode quickly out of the ballroom, the door swinging shut behind them with a heavy thud. Caroline remained on stage, seemingly frozen in place. Her perfect poise had crumbled completely, leaving her looking suddenly younger and more vulnerable than I had seen her in years. Her wide eyes fixed on our grandfather, searching for some explanation. "Grandfather," she whispered, her voice small, "why didn't you tell me?" Benjamin's expression softened as he looked at her. "Caroline," he said gently, "you have the talent to do great things. But greatness always begins with how we treat others, especially those we believe are beneath us." His gaze flickered briefly to me before returning to her. "If you wish to walk a long path in this world, you must first learn to see everyone's value, not just your own." Tears welled in Caroline's eyes. Not the practiced photogenic tears she had perfected for moments of public emotion, but raw and genuine. Her chin trembled as she struggled to maintain composure. Without another word, she turned and walked off the stage, disappearing into a side door, rather than following our parents' dramatic exit. My grandfather turned to the stunned crowd and spoke with renewed authority. "From tonight onward, Parker Enterprises will return to the principles upon which it was founded, creating dignified work, conducting business with integrity, and valuing people as much as profit. Those who stand with us for these values are welcome to stay. For those who only seek status and wealth, the doors are not locked." A low murmur of approval rose from several corners of the room. An older woman, one of the company's first employees, I later learned, raised her glass in a silent toast. Others followed, nodding in agreement. In that moment, I realized the invisible network that had sustained the company through decades was shifting its allegiance. Michael Keating stepped forward and addressed the crowd. "A formal announcement regarding the leadership transition will be issued tomorrow. For now, I suggest we allow Miss Harper time to process these changes." He gestured toward the back of the room where servers were still circulating with champagne. "Please continue to enjoy the evening." Slowly, the tension in the room began to dissipate. Guests broke into small clusters, their excited whispers creating a buzz throughout the ballroom. I knew I had become the subject of every conversation, but for once being seen didn't feel like a threat. My grandfather leaned close to my ear, his voice low enough that only I could hear. "You don't need to be perfect, Harper. You don't even need to be like me. You only need to hold on to what I've always seen in you, your capacity to listen, to care, and to stand firm when it matters most." I nodded, feeling tears prick at the corners of my eyes. He squeezed my hand gently, then whispered, "There's more in that safe at my house. Things you'll need in the days to come. The key is taped beneath the letter I wrote you." Before I could ask what he meant, Michael approached us. "Mr. Westbrook, perhaps you should sit down. It's been a long evening." My grandfather nodded suddenly, looking tired. I helped him to a chair at the edge of the stage, worry creasing my brow. Despite the triumph of the moment, I couldn't help but notice how frail he appeared under the bright lights. "I'm fine," he assured me, seeing my concern. "Just tired. This was necessary but not easy." As my grandfather rested, Michael drew me aside. "Your father will challenge this," he warned quietly. "He's already been trying to restructure the company to diminish your grandfather's influence. That's partly why Benjamin acted when he did." "How did you know to find me here tonight?" I asked. "I've been watching you for some time," Michael admitted. "At your grandfather's request. He wanted to be sure you were ready." "Ready for what?" "For the fight that's coming," he replied grimly. "Thomas won't give up control easily." As if to confirm his words, my phone buzzed in my small evening purse. I pulled it out to find a text from my father. "This isn't over. Expect to hear from our attorneys in the morning." I showed the message to Michael, who merely nodded. "As expected, but don't worry, your grandfather has prepared for this moment for years. Every document is ironclad." The weight of what had just happened began to settle on my shoulders. In a single evening, I had gone from the forgotten daughter to the majority owner of an $80 million company. The responsibility was dizzying. "I don't know how to run a company," I confessed to Michael, voicing the same doubt Caroline had raised. He smiled slightly. "That's exactly why your grandfather chose you. Because you know what you don't know." He glanced around the room, then added, "And because you understand something your father and sister never have, that a business is built on relationships, not just transactions." Throughout the remainder of the evening, various guests approached me cautiously, introducing themselves as if meeting me for the first time, which in many ways they were. Longtime employees, business partners, even friends of the family, who had overlooked me at countless previous events, now sought me out. A woman in her 60s with silver hair and keen eyes approached and introduced herself as Margaret Chen, the company's first human resources director, hired by my grandfather 30 years earlier. "I've waited a long time to see the company return to its roots," she told me, her voice warm with approval. "Benjamin built something special. Then your father turned it into something else entirely." "What was it like before?" I asked, genuinely curious. She smiled, remembering. "People were valued. Decisions weren't just about the bottom line. Benjamin understood that loyal employees build a stronger company than frightened ones." She studied my face for a moment, then nodded, as if confirming something to herself. "You have his eyes, not just the color, the way you look at people really seeing them." As the night progressed, I learned more about the company from its employees than I had ever heard from my father's boasting. I discovered that my grandfather had created one of the first profit-sharing programs in Boston, had refused to lay off workers during the recession of the early 1990s, and had established a scholarship fund for employees' children that my father had later reduced to almost nothing. By midnight, the crowd had thinned considerably. My grandfather had left earlier, escorted home by his nurse, who had arrived discreetly at Michael's call. I stood at the edge of the now quiet ballroom, trying to process everything that had happened. A movement near the side door caught my attention. Caroline stood there watching me. Her perfect makeup was smudged from tears, her crystal-studded gown now seeming more like armor than finery. After a moment's hesitation, she walked toward me. "I didn't know," she said simply when she reached me, "about grandfather's decision." "Neither did I admitted. "Not until tonight." She nodded, her eyes searching my face as if seeing me clearly for the first time. "What are you going to do?" she asked finally. The question hung between us, weighted with all our shared history, the competition, the resentment, the rare moments of connection. "I'm going to rebuild what father broke," I said after a moment, "starting with the company's values." "And me?" Her voice held a vulnerability I hadn't heard since we were children. "What happens to me in your new vision?" I studied my sister, seeing beyond the perfect facade to the woman who had been as trapped by our parents' expectations as I had been, just in a different way. That depends on you, I said honestly. You have incredible skills, Caroline. Intelligence, education connections, but you've been using them to please father, not to build something meaningful. She flinched slightly at my words but didn't deny them. If you want a role in the company, I continued, it won't be the one father promised you. It would be one based on what you can actually contribute, not on your status as the favorite daughter. Caroline was quiet for a long moment, processing my words. Finally, she asked, "How did you do it?" "Do what?" "Survive being the one they overlooked." Her question seemed genuine, stripped of its usual condescension. I always thought you were weak for accepting it, but maybe it took a different kind of strength. I considered her question carefully. I found value outside their approval, I said finally. In my work and my art, in grandfather's belief in me. I learned that their judgment wasn't the measure of my worth. Caroline nodded slowly. I don't know who I am without their approval, she admitted, her voice barely audible. Everything I've done has been to please them, especially father. In that moment, I saw my sister not as my lifelong tormentor, but as another casualty of our parents' toxic values. While I had been cast aside, she had been placed on a pedestal so high that she couldn't safely step down. Maybe it's time to find out who you really are, I suggested gently. She gave me a long look, then turned and walked away without another word, her gown shimmering under the dimmed chandelier lights as she disappeared through the ballroom doors. I left the Four Seasons shortly after declining Michael's offer to drive me home. Instead, I walked through the quiet Boston streets, the cool night air clearing my head. I didn't go back to my parents' Beacon Hill mansion. I couldn't face that house, that dining table, the physical reminder of years of invisibility. Instead, I returned to my small apartment in Somerville, the one I'd rented with my own earnings from the coffee shop and grocery store jobs. It was modest, but mine the first space where I had truly belonged. I sat at my small kitchen table and carefully spread out the documents, reading each page thoroughly. The scope of what my grandfather had entrusted to me was overwhelming. Beyond the company shares and the mansion, there were trust accounts, investment portfolios, and detailed records of company history that revealed how dramatically my father had changed my grandfather's original vision. I read my grandfather's letter again, this time noticing details I had missed in the shock of the initial moment. He had been planning this for years, watching both Caroline and me, assessing who would best preserve the company's true legacy. He mentioned a journal he had kept documenting his observations of our development and my father's management decisions. That must be what he meant about more information in the safe. As I sat surrounded by papers that rewrote my future, I thought about the long walnut dining table that had been the stage for so much of my childhood pain. I thought about my position at the far end, straining to be heard, to be seen. Tomorrow, I would face my father's legal challenges. I would begin the daunting task of learning to lead a company I had only ever observed from the periphery. I would navigate the complicated relationship with my sister and the complete reshaping of my identity in Boston's business community. But tonight, in the quiet of my own small kitchen, at my own small table, where no one told me where to sit, I felt a sense of peace I had never known in my parents' house. For the first time, I didn't have to strain to be heard. I didn't have to fight to be seen. My grandfather had seen me all along, had recognized my value when no one else did, and had entrusted me with his life's work. I thought about Caroline's question, how I had survived being the overlooked one, and realized there was more to my answer. Being overlooked had taught me to see others who were overlooked. Being silenced had taught me to listen for voices that weren't being heard. Being pushed to the end of the table had taught me to notice who wasn't at the table at all. Perhaps these were exactly the qualities needed to restore my grandfather's vision for the company, to make it once again a place where people were valued above profit margins, where integrity mattered more than image, where the measure of success wasn't just the bottom line, but the lives improved. My phone buzzed with another text from my father. "You have no idea what you've done. This company will collapse in your hands." I didn't reply. Instead, I picked up my grandfather's letter and read the final lines again. "You grew up in shadows, in silence, but that silence forged in you a strength they will never have. For the first time, I truly believed those words. The strength had always been there waiting for the moment to emerge from the shadows. Tonight was just the beginning. I folded the documents carefully and placed them back in the envelope. Tomorrow, I would visit my grandfather's house in Cambridge, open the safe, and discover what else he had left to guide me. Tomorrow, I would begin the work of reclaiming not just the company, but the values it was built upon. But tonight, I allowed myself to feel the sweet justice of the moment, not as revenge against my family, but as the vindication of my own worth. The invisible daughter had finally been seen. The silent voice would finally be heard. And the girl at the end of the table would now be rebuilding the table itself, deciding who deserved a seat and why. As I drifted off to sleep that night, I wondered what my first act as majority owner should be. The answer came easily, rising from years of watching how my father's leadership had eroded the company's soul. I would restore the employee scholarship program my grandfather had created, the one my father had gutted. I would begin by giving back to the families who had helped build the company. It felt right, a small first step toward healing what had been broken. Not just the company, but perhaps someday even my family. The path ahead would not be easy. My father would fight. Caroline's future role remained uncertain. The company itself needed significant reform to return to my grandfather's vision. But for the first time in my life, I didn't fear the challenge. I had spent 27 years learning to survive in the shadows. Now it was time to step into the light and build something new from all that hard-earned wisdom. The company's future, and my own, had been rewritten in a single evening. But the story was just beginning. Morning sunlight streamed through the windows of my small Somerville apartment, illuminating the documents spread across my kitchen table. I had barely slept, my mind racing with everything that had happened the night before. The enormity of what lay ahead was both exhilarating and terrifying. My phone had been buzzing since dawn, texts from my father growing increasingly threatening, missed calls from my mother, and a single message from Caroline that simply read, "We need to talk." There were also emails from company executives, board members, and even a few journalists who had somehow obtained my contact information. The Boston business world had awakened to the news of the Parker family drama, and I was suddenly at the center of it all. I showered and dressed with purpose, choosing a simple but professional outfit, rather than the fashionable clothes my mother had always pushed on me. Today would be my first day as the majority owner of Parker Enterprises, and I needed to look the part, my part, not the role my parents would have scripted for me. Before facing the corporate storm, I needed to see my grandfather. I drove to Cambridge, parking outside the familiar red brick house with its garden of lavender. The morning was crisp, the air carrying that distinctive New England fall sharpness that had always made me feel more alive. I used my key to let myself in, calling out softly, "Grandfather." His nurse, Mrs. Sullivan, appeared from the kitchen. "He's in the library, Harper. He's been expecting you." I found him seated by the window, a leather-bound journal open on his lap, sunlight casting a golden glow across his weathered face. Despite the events of the previous night, he looked peaceful, even energized. "You caused quite a stir last night," he said with a small smile as I entered. "I think you're the one who caused the stir," I replied, sitting in the chair opposite him. "Why didn't you tell me what you were planning?" He closed the journal and placed it on the side table. "Would you have been ready if I had—" I considered his question honestly. "No," I admitted. "I would have doubted myself. I might have tried to talk you out of it." He nodded. "Exactly. You needed to discover your strength in the moment, not prepare a performance." His eyes, still sharp despite his failing health, studied my face. "How do you feel this morning?" "Overwhelmed," I said truthfully. "But also free somehow. Like I've stepped out of a role I never chose into one that actually fits." My grandfather smiled, pleased with my answer. "The safe," he said, gesturing toward the painting behind his desk. "Open it now." I moved to the Boston Harbor painting and swung it open on its hidden hinges, revealing the wall safe. Using the key I had found taped beneath his letter, I unlocked it and pulled open the heavy door. Inside were several leather-bound journals, similar to the one my grandfather had been reading, a stack of folders labeled with dates spanning 30 years in a small wooden box. The journals chronicle my observations of you and Caroline from childhood, he explained as I carried everything to the desk. The folders contain evidence of your father's management decisions, the good and the bad. And the box, he paused. The box contains something personal. I opened the wooden box first, finding inside an antique silver key and a photograph I'd never seen before. It showed a young woman standing beside my grandfather in front of a small stone cottage surrounded by wildflowers. Your grandmother, he said, noticing my focus on the photo. At our summer cottage in Maine, a place your father knows nothing about. I looked up in surprise. I didn't know we had a cottage in Maine. We don't officially. It's in a trust, separate from the family assets. I purchased it before I married your grandmother, and we kept it as our private retreat. His eyes grew distant with memory. It's where I did my best thinking away from the noise of the city and business. The key opens the front door. The cottage and the land around it now belong to you. I held the key tightly, touched by this private gift. Thank you. You may need a place to retreat in the days ahead, he said, his expression growing serious. Your father will not surrender easily. As if on cue, my phone rang. Michael Keating's name flashed on the screen. Harper, he said when I answered, his voice tense. Your father has called an emergency board meeting for noon today. He's attempting to challenge the validity of the share transfer. I glanced at my watch, 10:30 a.m. Can he do that? He can try, Michael replied. The documents are legally sound, but he'll use whatever influence he has with the board to create obstacles. You need to be there. I will, I assured him. Where? Company headquarters, main boardroom. I'll meet you in the lobby at 11:30. I ended the call and turned to my grandfather. The battle begins, I said, trying to keep my voice steady despite the anxiety bubbling up. He nodded. Take the journals and folders. Read them when you can. They'll help you understand what you're fighting for. He reached for my hand. Remember, Harper, this isn't about defeating your father. It's about restoring what matters. I squeezed his hand, drawing strength from his calm confidence. I'll try to make you proud. You already have, he replied simply. I gathered the materials from the safe, kissed my grandfather goodbye, and drove to the gleaming glass tower in downtown Boston that housed Parker Enterprises. The building had always intimidated me, a physical manifestation of my father's power and my own exclusion. Today, I approached it with different eyes, seeing not just my father's empire, but my grandfather's legacy. The lobby was bustling with employees, many of whom did a double take as I walked through the revolving doors. Word had clearly spread about last night's events. Some looked curious, others wary, and a few mostly older employees who might have worked under my grandfather offered small nods of encouragement. Michael was waiting by the security desk, impeccable in a charcoal suit. They've expanded the meeting, he informed me as he led me toward the elevator. Your father has invited several major shareholders and key executives. He's trying to build a coalition. Against me. Against the change you represent, Michael corrected. Many of them have benefited from your father's management style. They'll resist returning to your grandfather's vision. The elevator whisked us to the top floor where the executive offices and boardroom were located. Through the glass walls, I could see the room already filled with men and women in expensive suits, my father standing at the head of the table, leaning over to speak with an older man I recognized as Walter Grimes, the chief financial officer. As we entered, conversations hushed. All eyes turned toward me. My father straightened his face, a mask of professional composure that didn't quite hide the anger in his eyes. Harper, he said, his voice cool. How kind of you to join us. I matched his tone, refusing to be intimidated. I wouldn't miss it. After all, as majority shareholder, these meetings are rather important to me now. A ripple of uncomfortable shifting passed through the room. I recognized most of the faces, board members I'd glimpsed at company events, executives my father had praised at family dinners. Near the far end sat Caroline, looking pale but composed in a navy business suit, her hair pulled back severely. Please take a seat, My father gestured to an empty chair, not at the head of the table where he stood, but halfway down, as if to immediately establish that I wasn't really in charge. Instead of taking the offered seat, I moved deliberately to the head of the table. "Thank you, but I believe this position is appropriate now." My father's jaw tightened, but he stepped aside, taking a seat to the right. The position of honor he had always reserved for Caroline at our dining table at home. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone in the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, surprising myself with the steadiness of my voice. "I understand there are questions about the transfer of shares and leadership of Parker Enterprises. Mr. Keating is here to address the legal aspects. But first, I'd like to be clear about my intentions." I looked around the table, meeting each person's eyes briefly before continuing. "Parker Enterprises was founded by my grandfather on principles that have been gradually abandoned. My goal is not to dismantle what works, but to restore what's been lost, a commitment to ethical business practices, employee welfare, and sustainable growth." Walter Grimes cleared his throat. "With all due respect, Miss Parker, those are lovely sentiments, but this company has seen record profits under your father's leadership. The shareholders have received excellent returns I finished for him. While employee benefits have been cut, ethical corners have been cut, and the company's reputation has suffered in ways that don't show up on quarterly reports." I opened one of my grandfather's folders and slid out a document. For instance, the Employee Scholarship Fund that was reduced by 80% 3 years ago despite record profits that same year. Walter shifted uncomfortably. My father leaned forward. "Harper, you're new to this world. These decisions were made for sound business reasons." "I'm sure they were," I interrupted calmly. "But sound business depends on how you define success. Grandfather defined it differently than you do." Michael stepped forward, placing a stack of documents on the table. "I've prepared copies of the legal transfer of shares for everyone. As you'll see, everything is in order. Ms. Parker now holds 51% of voting shares. While the board retains its governance responsibilities, major strategic decisions ultimately require her approval." The room filled with the sound of rustling papers as everyone examined the documents. My father sat rigid in his chair, his expression carefully neutral, though I could see the pulse throbbing in his temple. "This is highly unusual," said Rebecca Chen, the head of legal affairs. "Mr. Westbrook transferred these shares without any transition period or preparation of the new majority shareholder." "My grandfather believed I was prepared in ways that weren't obvious," I replied. "Not through Harvard Business School or board meetings, but through understanding the company's original values." "Values don't pay dividends," muttered someone down the table. "Actually, they do," I countered. "Long-term loyalty from employees reduces turnover costs. Ethical practices prevent costly scandals and lawsuits. Community investment creates customer goodwill." My grandfather understood this. Somewhere along the way, we forgot. My father stood suddenly. "This is absurd. Harper has no experience, no qualifications. She's worked in a coffee shop, for God's sake. She'll run this company into the ground within a year." For the first time, Caroline spoke up. "That's not fair, Father." All eyes turned to her in surprise. "Harper may lack formal business education, but she knows people. She listens. That's a skill, too." The room fell silent. My sister's defense was the last thing anyone had expected, myself included. Our eyes met briefly across the table, and I saw something I'd rarely seen from Caroline: respect. My father looked between us, momentarily thrown off balance by this unexpected alliance. He recovered quickly. "Sentiment won't satisfy the shareholders when profits fall." "Perhaps," I acknowledged, "but I'm not proposing we abandon profitability. I'm proposing we achieve it ethically with a longer view of success." I turned to Walter. "I'd like to see projections for restoring the employee scholarship program and healthcare benefits to their previous levels." Walter blinked in surprise. "That would increase expenses significantly, and potentially decrease turnover, increase productivity, and improve recruitment," I countered. "I want to see the full analysis, not just the cost side." My father laughed shortly. "You see, this is what happens when you put someone with no business acumen in charge. Costs go up, profits go down, shareholders revolt." I kept my voice steady. "Or perhaps this is what happens when you remember that a company is made of people, not just numbers on a spreadsheet." For the next 2 hours, the meeting continued. In this vein, challenges to my authority, questions about my qualifications, and thinly veiled threats about what might happen if I pursued my grandfather's vision too aggressively. Through it all, I remained calm, allowing Michael to handle the legal questions, while I focused on articulating my vision for the company's future. By the end, it was clear the room had divided into factions, those loyal to my father, those intrigued by the return to my grandfather's values, and those still undecided waiting to see which way the wind would blow. As the meeting concluded, my father approached me, lowering his voice so only I could hear. "This isn't over, Harper. I built this company into what it is today. I won't watch you dismantle it with naive idealism." I met his gaze steadily. "You renamed Westbrook Trading as Parker Enterprises, but you didn't build it. And I'm not dismantling anything, I'm remembering its foundation." He stepped back, studying me with new eyes. "You sound like him." "Thank you," I replied simply. As the board members and executives filed out, Caroline lingered. When we were alone, except for Michael, who was gathering his papers, she approached me. "That was impressive," she said, sounding genuinely surprised. "You held your ground." "Thank you for speaking up," I replied. "You didn't have to do that." She shrugged slightly. "Maybe I'm tired of being on the wrong side of things." She hesitated, then added, "I meant what I said. You understand people in a way I never learned to. Maybe because you had to listen while I was always being listened to." The acknowledgement of our different roles in the family felt like a small miracle. "What will you do now?" I asked. Caroline looked thoughtful. "I don't know. Everything I've worked for was aimed at taking over this company. Now that path is gone." "Not necessarily," I said. "The path you envisioned is gone, but there could be another one." "What do you mean?" "You have skills I don't have: formal education, relationships with clients, technical knowledge of our operations. I could use those skills, just not in the role Father designed for you." She considered this, her expression unreadable. "I'll think about it," she said finally. "But first, I need some time. This has been—" She gestured, vaguely unable to find the right word for the seismic shift in our family dynamic. "I understand," I assured her. "Take whatever time you need." After Caroline left, Michael turned to me. "That went better than expected. You handled yourself well." "It's just the beginning," I replied. "Father won't give up easily." "No, he won't," Michael agreed. "But neither will you, I suspect." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity as I established my presence at Parker Enterprises. I met with department heads, reviewed financial reports, and spent hours poring over my grandfather's journals and folders, learning the company's history and my father's gradual reshaping of its culture. The journals were particularly illuminating. My grandfather had observed Caroline and me from childhood with remarkable insight. He noted Caroline's intelligence and drive, but worried about her need for validation and her difficulty connecting with others. He saw my empathy and resilience, my ability to thrive despite being overlooked. He had been preparing me for this role long before I knew it existed. My father, as expected, mounted a legal challenge to the share transfer, claiming my grandfather had been unduly influenced and wasn't of sound mind. The case was weak. Michael had ensured every document was properly witnessed and executed with medical evaluations, confirming my grandfather's mental competence. Still, the legal battle created uncertainty and divided loyalties within the company. I faced resistance from executives loyal to my father, particularly Walter Grimes and the Vice President of Operations, James Reynolds. They questioned every decision, delayed implementing changes, and sometimes worked around me entirely, going directly to board members with their concerns. But I also found allies. Margaret Chen from HR became an invaluable supporter, helping me understand the company's structure and identifying employees who still remembered my grandfather's approach. The head of product development, Sofia Rodriguez, enthusiastically embraced my push for more ethical sourcing practices. And surprisingly, Rebecca Chen from legal, after initially questioning my qualifications, became one of my strongest advocates once she saw I was serious about compliance and transparency. My first major victory came a month after taking control. Despite Walter's dire predictions, the board approved my proposal to restore the employee scholarship program, expanded to include not just college tuition for employees' children, but also technical training and certification programs for employees themselves. The announcement was met with enthusiasm from staff, particularly those who had been with the company since my grandfather's time. I worked long hours arriving early and staying late absorbing as much information as I could. My small apartment became more of a storage space than a home, as I spent most of my time at the office or at my grandfather's house, discussing strategy with him while his health still permitted. One evening, as I was reviewing contracts in my new office, the one that had been my father's, though I'd removed the imposing dark furniture and replaced it with simpler, more welcoming pieces, there was a knock at the door. Caroline entered looking hesitant but determined. "You're still here," she observed. "It's almost 9. I smiled wryly. Apparently running a company requires more than coffee shop experience. To my surprise, she laughed. "You're doing better than anyone expected. Even father, though he'd never admit it." "How is he?" I asked. I hadn't spoken to either of my parents since the emergency board meeting. My mother had left several voicemails alternately pleading and threatening, but my father had maintained a cold silence, communicating only through lawyers. Caroline sighed, settling into one of the chairs across from my desk. "Angry, humiliated, convinced you're going to destroy his legacy." She paused. "Mother is worried about what people are saying. You know how she is about appearances." I nodded, feeling a pang of sympathy despite everything. My parents had always been so concerned with status, with being admired. The public nature of this transition must be excruciating for them. "I've been thinking about your offer," Caroline continued, "about finding a different role here. And," I prompted when she didn't elaborate, "and I think I'd like to try." She straightened in her chair, looking more vulnerable than I'd ever seen her. "I've spent my whole life preparing to run this company, just not in the way grandfather envisioned. I know the operations, the clients, the market. I could help if you'd let me." "What role are you thinking of?" I asked. "Chief Operating Officer," she replied promptly. "James Reynolds is loyal to father and undermining you at every turn. I could take his place, handle the day-to-day operations, while you focus on the bigger vision and cultural changes." I studied her face, looking for signs of the old Caroline, the competitive, sometimes cruel sister, who had lorded her status over me for years. Instead, I saw someone trying to find her footing in a landscape that had shifted beneath her feet. "Why should I trust you?" I asked directly. She didn't flinch at the question. "Because I have nowhere else to go," she admitted with surprising honesty. "Everything I've built has been here. And because—" She hesitated, then pushed forward. "Because I think grandfather might have been right about both of us. You see things I miss. Maybe I know things you need." I considered her proposal. There was risk in bringing Caroline into leadership, but also potential. She did know the business intimately, and perhaps working together would heal some of the wounds of our childhood. "Okay," I said finally. "But we do this my way. The company returns to grandfather's values. We prioritize ethics, employee welfare, and sustainable growth alongside profitability." "Agreed," she said, and for the first time in years, I felt like we were truly seeing each other. The following week, I announced James Reynolds' departure and Caroline's appointment as COO. The news was met with surprise throughout the company and outrage from my father, who saw it as Caroline betraying him. But as the weeks passed, the wisdom of the decision became apparent. Caroline's operational knowledge complemented my focus on culture and values. Together, we began reshaping Parker Enterprises into something that honored our grandfather's vision while acknowledging the realities of modern business. 3 months after the night that had changed everything, I visited my grandfather in the hospital. His health had deteriorated rapidly, and we both knew our time together was growing short. "The cottage," he said weakly as I sat beside his bed. "Have you visited it?" I shook my head. "I've been too busy with the company." He smiled faintly. "Go soon. It's good to remember there's more to life than business." I nodded, fighting back tears. "I will." "How is Caroline adjusting?" he asked. "Better than I expected," I admitted. She knows the company inside out, and I think she's discovering who she is beyond father's expectations. And you? He asked, his eyes still sharp despite his failing body. Are you finding your way? I thought about the past 3 months, the challenges, the resistance, the small victories. I am, I said. It's not easy. Sometimes I still feel like the girl at the end of the table straining to be heard. But then I remember that I don't have to strain anymore. I can speak, and people listen. He squeezed my hand weakly. That's the true inheritance, Harper. Not the money or the company, the knowledge of your own worth. 2 days later, Benjamin Westbrook passed away peacefully in his sleep. The funeral was attended by hundreds of employees past and present, business associates, friends, and family. My parents were there standing stiffly apart from Caroline and me. My mother wore an appropriately somber expression, though her eyes darted constantly to see who was watching. My father remained stone-faced throughout the service. After the burial, as people gathered at my grandfather's Cambridge home, my father approached me for the first time in months. He was a stubborn man, he said, his voice gruff with what might have been grief or merely discomfort. He was principled, I corrected gently. There's a difference. My father's jaw tightened. He never understood that business has changed. His methods wouldn't work today. Perhaps, I acknowledged. Or perhaps we changed business unnecessarily, prioritizing short-term gains over long-term values. He studied me for a moment, then asked abruptly, why Caroline? Why bring her into leadership after everything? The question surprised me. Because she deserves a chance to find her own way just as I did, and because she's good at what she does. Something flickered across his face, confusion perhaps, or the faintest recognition of a perspective he'd never considered. Before he could respond, my mother joined us, her hand possessively on his arm. The governor just arrived, she said, pointedly ignoring me. We should greet him. As they walked away, Caroline appeared at my side. That looked intense. Just the usual disagreement about business philosophy, I replied. She nodded understanding. They may never change, you know. I know, I said. But we have. The week after the funeral, I finally took my grandfather's advice and drove to the cottage in Maine. It was a small stone building perched on a cliff overlooking the Atlantic, surrounded by wildflowers, even in the early fall. Inside was simple but comfortable, a living room with a stone fireplace, a kitchen with an old wood stove, 2 bedrooms, and a study lined with bookshelves. On the desk in the study, I found a framed photograph of my grandfather and grandmother standing on the cliff edge, young and smiling into the wind. Beside it was a journal I hadn't seen before. Opening it, I recognized my grandfather's handwriting. But these weren't his observations of the family or the company. They were his reflections on life, on what truly mattered beyond business success. The true measure of wealth, one entry read, is not what you accumulate, but what you give, that creates more for others than it takes from you. I sat at the desk looking out at the endless expanse of ocean and began to write in a journal of my own. Not about business strategies or company transitions, but about the journey that had brought me here, from the invisible girl at the end of the table to the woman now responsible for hundreds of lives and my grandfather's legacy. I thought about the dining table that had symbolized so much of my childhood pain. In the months since taking control of Parker Enterprises, I had instituted a new tradition: weekly lunches with employees from different departments, hosted at a round table in the company cafe. No head of the table, no place of honor, just equal seats in a circle where everyone could be seen and heard. Caroline had raised an eyebrow when I first proposed it. A bit on the nose with the symbolism, isn't it? She'd added. Sometimes symbols matter, I'd replied. Now, sitting in my grandfather's cottage, watching the waves crash against the rocks below, I understood more deeply what he had seen in me all those years. Not just empathy or resilience, but the vision to build a different kind of table, one where value wasn't determined by position, but by contribution. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. It was Michael Keating. The board unanimously approved the Community Investment Initiative, he said when I answered. Even Walter voted yes. I smiled. The initiative would direct a percentage of profits to education and environmental projects in communities where we operated, another step toward restoring my grandfather's vision. Thank you for letting me know, I said. I'll be back tomorrow. No rush, Michael replied. Caroline has things well in hand. She's actually managed to convince two of your father's strongest allies on the board to support the new direction. After we hung up, I returned to the window, watching the sun begin to set over the ocean. My grandfather had been right about the cottage. It provided perspective that was easy to lose in the day-to-day running of a company. I thought about the journey ahead. There would be more challenges, more resistance, more difficult decisions. My father might never accept the changes I was making. My mother might never see me as anything but the disappointing daughter. But none of that defined me anymore. I was Harper Parker, granddaughter of Benjamin Westbrook, the true heir, not just to his company, but to his vision of business as a force for good. I had found my voice, my place, my purpose. And I had built a new table, one where everyone had a seat, where everyone could be heard, where value wasn't determined by position, but by character. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. Tomorrow, I would return to Boston, to the company, to the work of honoring my grandfather's legacy. But tonight, in this peaceful cottage by the sea, I allowed myself to simply be grateful for the journey that had brought me here. From invisible to essential, from silent to heard, from the end of the table to the center of a circle. The true inheritance wasn't the company or the wealth. It was the wisdom to see what truly matters and the courage to build something worthy of those who come after us. That was the legacy I would carry forward. That was the true meaning of heir.